The key thing in this section, besides we have several parts. Part one is from DVD 1, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is none other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form. Like in the earlier section where we had the quantum lens, everything is emptiness and form is condensed emptiness. If we had a Buddhist lens and we put it on, we would see everything is empty with some particles. If we flipped the lens around and looked at what we would normally call ourselves, our body and our psyche or whatever, is looking this way, what you'd see is mostly emptiness. Douglas Harding had his own particular exercise where he would just ask you to go like this. So rather than your awareness going this way, you would take your attention and you would put your attention this way. And by looking this way, you'd notice that there was nothing there. So, post-deconstruction, the death of the subject I. So what we've seen in the past so far is that neuroscience says that the I only arises through biochemicals. Quantum physics is saying that the I only arises, and everything only arises only through new subatomic particles exchanging. Linguistics is going to say that the I only arises in language through the abstraction process. So even the sound of I, you only hear it and recognize it as I and associate it with this because of the transduction process. Pre-transduction, just sound, just noise, ah, 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 ah. Transduction, sound, I. Then later abstraction, I means this, and this is me, and description of who I am, abstraction upon abstraction upon abstraction. Now, Buddhism has a very, very key point. There is no self. Buddha simply denies the existence of a self. Now, one of the greatest teachers in Buddhism, Nagarjuna, in the 2nd century, created what is formed Madhyamika Buddhism. Madhyamika Buddhism means middle way Buddhism. Nagarjuna, who we'll discuss in later sections, came up with a very, very critical point. The point was called dependent origination. Dependent origination means that nothing arises independently. So, like in DVD 1, where the Buddha says there's no separate, independent, individual self, what Nagarjuna does is takes it a step further. Not only is there no separate, independent, individual self, the Buddha said, or soul, but everything arises as one substance. And as one substance, it arises as a fluid motion. Nothing can arise independently. The best way to discuss this is if everything in the universe was water. That means if you were a droplet of water, you would not arise in a wave independently of the entire ocean going along with it. The entire universe as water, as one substance, everything is dependent upon and interlinked with something else. So in order for the wave here to arise, this part of the ocean has to go down. In order for this part of the ocean to go down, this one has to come up. There's a dependent origination. Since there's a dependent origination, nothing is separate, individual, independent that can operate on its own. Now, why are all things devoid of a self being defined as a separate, independent nature? There is no self or independent nature because everything is dependent upon everything else. Now, Alan Watts had a way of saying this. Basically, if there's good, there's bad. If there's high, then there's low. If there's sin, then there's virtue. What he said is that spiritual people want to live in an up universe. There's up and there's down. They just want an up universe. They don't understand that up and down are totally connected. You cannot have up unless you have down. You cannot have good unless you have bad. You cannot have love unless you have hate. You cannot have courage unless you have fear. Everything is so interdependent and arises and originates dependent on everything else. So although we might want to live in only a love universe, there's love and there's hate. So once you mix them together, what you see is that love is devoid of a self or an independent self nature. It has to have its opposite. So therefore, there's no such thing as love without hate. There's no such thing as forgiveness without revenge. There's no such thing as sin without virtue. They're interlocked and interconnected. So no one thing has an independent individual nature onto itself. Everything is dependently arising, and everything originates and is dependent upon everything else. Again, if everything is the universe, then everything in the universe is water, then everything is dependent and arises according to everything else. Now, what's critical in this is, let's go back to the last section in linguistics. According to linguistics, all language occurs in what they call binaries. Binaries mean that I have good and bad. I have compassion, I have passion. I have forgiveness, I have, let's say, revenge. So all things exist in its complementary binary. Now, what spirituality does is it isolates. It says love is spiritual, hate is not spiritual. Forgiveness, spiritual. Revenge, not spiritual. Joy, spiritual. Sadness and pain, somehow not spiritual. Now, in a linguistic system, one term is considered higher or closer to God or somehow spiritual forms than is the other term. In this case, love is closer to God than hate. Obviously, everybody knows God is love. But the truth of the matter is, you cannot have love without hate. So therefore, these binaries are locked in and are a single unit. You cannot have one without the other. They arise and subside. There is dependent origination. In spiritual circles, again, they want to cut it off. These are spiritual, these are not spiritual. The two problems with this binary system is, one, that it dichotomizes and it presupposes that something can be closer to something else. Remember, if there's only one substance, not two, then it only is linguistically in a map or a philosophy or in a spiritual understanding, in a spiritual philosophy where love is good and hate is bad. So love is good and hate is bad in a spiritual context, but that's all that exists in. It has no independent nature, and there's no spiritual outside of the word spiritual. What happens in spiritual circles is we cut off or try to imagine that you can constantly and always be unconditionally loving when it absolutely goes in a binary nature. So to include both and rather than either or deconstructs both as an independent self-nature. So as biology deconstructs the self, the notion of self, as physics deconstructs the notion of self, as linguistics deconstructs the notion of self, Buddhism doesn't even acknowledge a self. There is no self with a separate, independent, individual self-nature. Notice a very quick review from the first DVD. Advaita means not two, one substance, not two. Vedanta, the end of the Vedas, which can be summarized as neti neti, not this, not this. Post-deconstruction, which we'll do in a later section, you'll see how all this integrates, uses the process of neti neti, discarding as not this, to realize the one substance, and ultimately to deconstruct the one substance context and the one substance concept. But first, just to review from last time, we did something similar to that. I would like to do a very short meditation. So I'm going to ask you to do is let your eyes close. Now, what I'd like you to do is to notice an experience. Be the experiencer of the experience. What occurs if the experiencer and the experience are made of the same substance? Notice a thought. Be the experiencer of the thought. Notice what occurs if the experiencer of the thought and the thought are made of the same substance.
Хлебцы Крозет – это красиво есть, креативно подавать. Хлебцы Крозет – хрустящее удовольствие.
Notice another thought. Be the experiencer of the thought. Notice what occurs if the experiencer and the experience are made of the same substance. Notice any experience that you are having. Be the observer or witness of the experience. Notice what occurs if the witness and the experience are made of the same consciousness, the same substance, the same energy. Very gently allow your eyes to open. And notice an object in the room. Pull your attention backward prior to any knowledge or information or association that you have about the object. So prior to, pull your attention backward prior to any knowledge or information about the object. Notice as you observe or witness the object from the no-state state of no information, knowledge, thoughts, or memories about it. Notice what occurs if the object and the witness are made of the same substance. Notice another object in the room. Pull your attention backward prior to any thoughts, memories, knowledge, information you have about the object. Notice the object from back there in the no-state state. Notice what occurs if the object and the observer of the object are made of the same substance. As you continue with your eyes open, notice me on the DVD. pull your attention backward prior to any thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, or perceptions, or knowledge or information about me, or that it's even a DVD. Notice that you are the knower of that blank, no state, prior to any thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, or perceptions. What happens if the knower and the blank, no state, are made of the same substance? Advaita, one substance, not two. And when the knower and the known, the observer, the observed, the witness and the witnessed, the perceiver and the perceived are not two but one, notice everything just goes blank, and you're in the no state prior to thoughts, memory, emotions, associations, perceptions. To review from the last DVD, Tantric Yoga, Tantra means the expansion of knowledge. The creme de la creme of Tantric Yoga is everything is consciousness, nothing exists outside of consciousness. My favorite story about Maharaj was a French psychiatrist came to see him. And he sat down, he was sitting in front of me, and he had this notebook, and he opened it up, and he went through this long-winded question about karma and reincarnation and births and deaths and credits and debits and virtue and sin. It went on and on and on and on and on and on. And I was sitting just behind him thinking, how is Maharaj going to answer this question? And he sat there, and he was a chain smoker, and he was sitting there smoking a cigarette. And he looked at the man and he said, "Who told you that you exist?" And there was this incredible silence. And he looked at his wife, and his wife looked at him. And Maharaj said, "Consciousness tells you you exist. And you believe it. If you understand just that much, it's enough." And he looked at his wife, and his wife looked at him, and they left. In the Yoga Vashishta, which I mentioned in the first DVD, that was kind of the mantra. Everything is consciousness, nothing exists outside of consciousness. Even to take this to a more extreme, Yoga Vashishta is an ancient text, one of the most famous texts in India. And in the Yoga Vashishta, as in all of the major texts, you have dialogues between the, in quotes, unenlightened and who's suffering and in pain, whether it be Arjuna from the Bhagavad Gita, or Ram from the Yoga Vashishta, or in Buddhism, one of the students, and they're discussing back and forth either with Lord Krishna or with Vashishta, the Guru, or with the Buddha. Now in the Yoga Vashishta, Lord Ram does not know he's Ram. He's suffering, he's in pain, he goes to his Guru Vashishta, and most of it is questions and answers between Ram and Vashishta. At one point, Vashishta says to him about the chakras, about Kundalini, about the chakras, how there's 72,000 nadis in the human body, and how the energy goes up the Kundalini and it pierces through the 7 chakras, and Shakti and Shiva, and they meet, and so on and so on. And he says to Ram, "Do you know what I mean?" And Ram says, well, of course I know what you mean. There are 72,000 nadis in the human body. There are 7 chakras. The Kundalini gets pierced. It goes up the channel, the Sushumna Nadi, and there where the top of the chakra, the Sahasrara, Shakti meets Shiva, and so on and so on. That's right, right? And Vasishtha says, no, that's not it at all. And Ram says, what do you mean that's not it? I said exactly, basically what you just told me. Vasishtha says, there's no such thing as Kundalini. There's no such thing as chakras. Everything is consciousness. Nothing exists outside of consciousness. There's only one substance. Ram says, then why did you tell me this whole story about Kundalini and chakras and nadis and purification and Sushumna Nadi? And Vasishtha says, it's a story for the unenlightened. In other words, it's a story, it's an abstracted representation of something that doesn't exist. Now in Tantric Yoga, everything is consciousness, nothing exists outside of consciousness. That's the good news. The bad news is that the undifferentiated consciousness is now depicted as an archetype called Shiva. The problem is that once you depict it as an archetype called Shiva, with the yogi sitting in full lotus and the Ganga coming out of his head and all of these types of things, you are moving it from undifferentiated consciousness to an archetypical representation. Once that is solidified, people think that Shiva, some being on Mount Kailas who's meditating, actually exists. And if I worship Shiva, then somehow this Shiva, this archetypical representation, is going to grant me this thing called liberation. So there are mantras, yantras, and tantras, all for Lord Shiva, which is an archetypical representation of something that doesn't exist. The problem with archetypes is that all archetypical representations and spiritual paths are representations of things that don't exist. The biggest problem is that you can never get out of an archetype from acting out the archetype. And if you don't believe me, you can look into your own experience. You can worship Lord Shiva forever. You can worship the Devi or the Mother forever. But these are archetypical representations of things that don't exist. So the practitioner of the archetype, the knower of the archetype, the participator in that particular path, is acting out an archetype. And you can never get out of an archetype until you see what it is, which is an abstracted representation of nothing. You'll just keep on reiterating it more and more and more and more and more. This reminds me of a story. I was once sitting with Nisargadatta, and an Indian man came in, and he said, in the Bhagavad Gita, it says the mother created the universe. And I worship the mother, and the mother will grant me liberation. And Maharaj said to him, who came first, you or the mother? He said, well, obviously the mother came first, and the mother created the universe, and then I worship her, and she grants me liberation. He said, no. First, you had to be there. First, the I am had to be produced and appear. And then once the I am appeared and is produced, the mother idea is produced. And then you worship the mother. He said, forget all of that. Just meditate on yourself. Stay focused on the I am and let go of everything else. So this is the danger of archetypical representations. All spiritual paths are archetypical representations. And once the map or the archetypical representation is, or the language or the words or the mantra, yantra, tantra is taken as true, then what you lose is the undifferentiated consciousness from which the archetype arose, and the archetype will subside. So, archetypical representation is a path to God. God is probably, as it is hardwired into the nervous system, is probably the most powerful archetypical representation on the planet. So we have a spiritual path leading to God. Once that is seen as an archetypical representation, an abstracted representation of something that doesn't exist, it disappears. I remember once having this experience. I'm sure many people who have listened to this DVD have had the experience of seeing God. I saw God and had this incredibly powerful experience. And somehow in the process of that experience, there was a deconstruction of the concept of God. And once that happened, everything disappeared. Yoga can be defined as either union, or yoga can be defined as to yoke, as to pull back your senses. So, if we go back to the Bhagavad Gita, which is the story of Lord Krishna talking to Arjuna, basically 2 volumes of questions and answers, we get to one critical point, how it relates to physics and how it relates to post-deconstruction. Remember, post-deconstruction deconstructs the I, that there is no I. So in the Bhagavad Gita, what Krishna basically teaches is that the world is a play of the elements. Now, if we go back thousands of years ago, their science would say that the world is made of earth, air, water, fire, and ether. And there really is no you. That these elements are in an interaction or in a play. And as these elements interact or play, you get the sense of I. But it requires all of these elements in play. The sense of I only exists because there's a combination of these elements which reforms this thing called I. Now that's thousands of years ago. If we go to present time in the world of physics, they would say that we have dimensions of reality. What are the dimensions of reality? We have energy, space, mass, time. We have gravity, light, sound, strong forces. We have electromagnetics. All of these forces interact. And it's through the interaction of these forces that we get a physical universe. So we go back thousands of years. We have earth, air, water, fire, and ether. And we have the forces called gunas. The gunas are sattvic guna, Rajaguna, and Tamaguna. So through an interaction of the forces and elements thousands of years ago, they describe the formation of I. Through the physics dimensions, energy, space, mass, time, etc., through that interaction, that play, if you will, we're getting the formation of I. But there is no I independent of the elements and independent of the gunas or forces. There is no I independent of the play or the interaction of the physics dimensions. So thousands of years ago or now, all come up with the same thing. Everything is dependent upon the elements and forces, period. This is where yoga of thousands of years ago meets quantum physics in present time. Just to illustrate, what David Bohm suggested years ago was, in a book called Quantum Theory about 1950, was in order for things to exist in the physical universe, they have to have energy, space, mass, and time. To explain what that means, in order for something to exist in the physical universe, you have to have this chair that I'm sitting on, or the arm, or your arm, or anything in the physical universe. You have to have a movement of electrons, so you have energy. It has to occupy a space. It has to have a solidness or a mass, and it has to exist in time, which means there's a time it didn't exist, there's a time it doesn't exist, and there's a time it won't exist again. There's a time it did exist, there's a time it does exist, and there's a time it won't exist again. If you were to eliminate any of these factors, energy, space, mass, or time, this chair, my body, anything could not exist. So, just as in quantum physics, the I, which you call I, is dependent upon an interaction of the play of the physics dimensions, although the languaging is different. The brilliance of yoga, as taught by Lord Krishna to Arjuna at the time, is that you have an interaction.
ВК-ID – это быстрый пропуск на ваш сайт или приложение для 100 миллионов пользователей Рунета. С ВК-ID анализируйте пользователя.
Play of the elements and forces. Maharaj even said, even the physical form of the guru is subject to the play of the gunas and a play of the elements. So the only difference is that one is languaging of the year 2005 and one is languaging of thousands of years ago. But we're both talking about the same thing. There is no I other than a play of the elements or a play of the physics dimensions. What we call I, we don't see it. What we call I, we don't see that it only occurs through the interaction of these things. We see an I that is separate and independent with a self-nature, which doesn't exist. Oftentimes I'm asked about spirituality, spiritual paths. How can I discern what might be of real value to find out who I am? We're going to define spirituality as finding out who you are. That's all it is. And so when they ask those kind of questions, I've only come up with two answers. How can I tell if something's really worthwhile, and what should I avoid? If there's an organization, if there's a mission, if there's a whole hierarchy, it's something to be avoided. So there are two acid tests. One, if there's an organization, a system where there's a hierarchy, avoid it. The second thing is the system willing to deconstruct itself? Any system or any form of spirituality or psychology that is not willing to deconstruct itself is one that I would avoid. In essence, all of it's bullshit. And so until you can deconstruct the deconstructing, it's something to be avoided. Over the last period of time, I've been in phone contact with Maharaj's primary translator. His name is Mula Patan, who's about 90 years old. Mula Patan was translating for Maharaj probably about 85% of the time. And if you watch the DVD or you watch the video put out by Inner Directions, what you're going to see is Mula Patan translating. He's about 90, and in our conversations, he told me this story once, that Maharaj pulled him into a room, and he said to him, with that one statement, Nisargadatta Maharaj himself was deconstructing everything he had said before. He was deconstructing himself. Forget Maharaj. Forget the teachings. Forget me. Just remember, just everything is consciousness. Stay in the consciousness. And that will be the door to the ultimate. That's it. So in order to deconstruct everything we have been through right now, and in that way remain in integrity with the acid test of no organization and deconstructing the process itself, I would like to look at one major figure in Buddhism, Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna I mentioned earlier as the 2nd century, and he was the founder of Madhyamika Buddhism. Nagarjuna came up with what is classically called the 8 negations of Nagarjuna. The first negation: there is no coming, there is no going. Now the best way I could describe this, which is a little bit different than Maharaj, is if everything in the universe, me, you, everything in the universe was water. One substance, and the substance was water. There could be no coming and going because there wouldn't be anything separate or different than anything else. His next negation: there is no arising, there is no subsiding. Why is there no arising and subsiding? If the whole universe was made of the same substance, and let's say the whole universe was made of the same substance, and the substance was water, how could anything arise and subside? See, for something to come and go, for something to arise and subside, there has to be a separate substance, separate from the one substance, to say that something was arising and subsiding, or that something was coming, or that something was going. The next negations: nothing is the same and nothing is different. Of course nothing is the same and nothing is different. Everything is the same substance, and there is only one substance. And everything is the same substance. There's no separate substance to say this is the same and this is different. The next negation: nothing exists, nothing doesn't exist. Once again, if everything is water and everything is the same substance, who is it separate from that to say there's existence or non-existence? Now in the first DVD, I told the story where Maharaj said, there is no birth, there is no death. In short, that's one of Nagarjuna's negations. Nothing is born, nothing dies. Nothing arises, nothing subsides. Nothing comes, nothing goes. In the talks with Maharaj on the first DVD, at the very, very end, somebody asks a question about why are we here? Why did we come here in the first place? And Maharaj uses the example of space.
देह मनामध्ये प्रवेश का करायला पाहिजे होता
कोणी केलाय
Who has entered? Who has entered the body mind form? Who?
या खोलीमध्ये आकाशाने प्रवेश केलाय की नाही का केला मी कसा केला
Now in the room, in this room the space has entered. In this room the space is there. Why the space has entered into this room? Why the space has entered into this room? And how? Why and how space has entered into this room?
This appears there was no space, there was no time.
हे कळलं मुश्किल आहे
The space is outside also, the space is here also. There is no distinction between inside space and outside space. It's all space only. So when the question of coming in and going out, and when the question of how and it exists always, space.
So post-deconstruction can be summarized as follows. I am that means I am that one substance. Post-deconstruction deconstructs even the one substance concept. In other words, there can only be one substance if there's something separate to say there's only one substance. Since the one that's saying there's only one substance and the one substance are one substance, then it all disappears. Hence, nirvana as extinction. So, as nirvana as extinction, that means that post-deconstruction has no organizing principle. It has no organization, and it automatically deconstructs itself. It only uses deconstruction to lead you to the ultimate deconstruction, to realize nirvana as extinction, that there is not even one substance. Again, if everything is water, and everything is just water, there's nothing separate from water, then there can be no being nor not being. There can be no inside, there can be no outside. There can be no action, there can be no not action. There can be no bondage, there can be no liberation. Why is this so critical and why is it true? Because the understructure of all spiritual paths is I am trapped or I am in bondage, and to compensate or to overcome that, I'm going to try to get free. Now, people can determine that freedom through a spiritual path, through making money, through having a relationship, but they're all trying to get out of I am trapped. But if everything is the one substance, and there's nothing separate from the one substance to say that there's only one substance, then not only is there no bondage or liberation, there is no being or not being. There is nirvana as extinction, or as Maharaj said, you can never say what it is, you can only say what it isn't. Back in about 1976, I was with Baba Prakashananda. And I said two things to him. The first thing I said was, tell me about your experiences. And he looked at me, probably one of the most loving people I'd ever met, and he said, if I tell you my experience, I'll think that I had it. He said, spiritual experiences are just ego. And consciousness is Maya. Consciousness is part of the illusion. When I said to him, what about liberation? And he looked at me and he said, what is liberation? And I said, well, oneness and merging and enlightenment and these types of things. And as I said it, of course, I realized that they were just ideas that I had. And he said to me, you don't want liberation. He said, if you have liberation, you won't be there to appreciate it. Nirvana is extinction. So in the final part of deconstruction itself, or post-deconstruction itself, what is the final way of deconstructing it and understanding it? Going back over the last sections that we've done, not only in the first DVD and the second DVD, if we look, say, for example, the nervous system and the brain and all of these things, what we have to understand that the nervous system and the brain and the body is a perception. The body is a perception, which means the body is an abstracted representation of something that's not there. The nervous system and brain are only there because there's a perceiver perceiving it. Since the perceiver and the perception are both abstracted representations of things that do not exist, then the creme de la creme, the ultimate understanding in yoga, you are not the body, becomes even clearer. More importantly, all of these things become metaphoric representations. Is there energy? Is there space? Is there mass? Is there time? Are there the physics dimensions? There's only the physics dimensions if there's a perceiver there perceiving it, either with a microscope or an electron microscope or a telescope. They're perceivers using instruments, and what they see is still an abstracted representation of something that's not there. The looker is an abstracted representation, a metaphor of something that's not there. In the first DVD, we used the most important sutra, I think, of all time, Drishti Shrushti Vada, Sanskrit. The world is only there as long as there's an I there to perceive it. So now we've deconstructed not only the biological, the physics. There's no elements in yoga. There's no elements in yoga because it requires a perceiver there to perceive them. It's all abstractions of something that's not there. It's a way of describing something that isn't. All descriptions describe things that actually do not exist in and of themselves. Everything is consciousness. Nothing exists outside of consciousness. A description. Whether we say everything is made of water, or as Maharaj said, everything is made of space. They are all metaphoric descriptions that are dependent upon a perceiver perceiving them. No perceiver, then they are not. So, post-deconstruction leaves us with there's only one substance, but there actually isn't one substance at all. And all of these metaphoric understandings lead us to the final understanding. Without a perceiver there to perceive them, they're not. Nirvana is extinction.